Hi, good afternoon.
Good
I think,
afternoon.
hi, I think we have a pretty small group, two or three, I guess. So that's good news. We'll be able to get through this. I think this is probably your last section for the modules. So we will go through. It's generally takes about 2 hours. We'll go through a lot of information. If you have any questions, just by all means ask throughout the presentation. Especially with a small group, it's easier to kind of go through these things. And we will cover a lot of ground though. So I will forewarn you, we do cover a lot of information, and most of it is Ontario based, but it is equally applicable across Canada. There will be a number of sections where there are case studies. In this case, where it's a small group, just please unmute yourself and tell us your answer, and we will go through it hopefully very quickly. So I'm gonna take my camera off just while we're doing the presentation. I do find it a little distracting, and we will take a break approximately halfway through. Okay, so this is I believe, your final module, the health and safety module, and it is part of the 6 modules now. They've added a 6 module. I haven't updated this slide yet, and we will be covering specific information regarding health and safety. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I've been dealing with health and safety as a temporary employment agency person for the last almost 20 years. I do it across Canada, and I've been teaching this module course for about 12 years, I believe. And so I've had the opportunity to assist a lot of people with their CPC and just going through the modules required. And I've always viewed the CPC module as very beneficial. It's for the temporary employment industry, and it's put on by the temporary employment industry. So we do have some very specific sort of challenges, especially with regards to health and safety, which we'll get into. And it's important for us to understand it from that perspective. The ACSESS mission statement, I'm not going to go through. You've probably gone through this 4 or 5 times already. The code of ethics, very important to make sure you understand that, especially as you write the CPC course. Some of the learning objectives that we're going to go through today. We're going to take a look at the Occupational Health and Safety Act. We're going to be looking at WHMIS, critical injuries, designated substances, first aid, some basic injury and illness reporting, and how they kind of all interplay with each other. Some specific topics we're going to be looking at: safety principles and risk management. We're going to be looking at a lot of legislation today, so it will be a little bit heavy, but we will get through it appropriately, and make sure you have the right information to be successful in your CPC test writing. We're going to be looking at rights and responsibilities. We're going to be looking at hazard recognition and control measures. We're going to be looking at workplace inspections and accident investigations, developing and implementing an effective workplace program. The idea is, once you're done this module, this isn't a comprehensive module. It's not going to make you an expert in health and safety. It'll give you a good foundation, though, especially as it applies to an employer operating within Canada. Some of the roles, responsibilities, some of the requirements you may have, and hopefully it's thought-provoking, as every one of us is from a different company. You can go back to your own company and say, okay, I learned this. How do we apply it, or how are we using it, or do we have all the elements in place? And we want to make sure that you can find the applicable health and safety and occupational health and safety legislation. We want to make sure that you know your responsibilities with regards to health and safety, determine ways of meeting your occupational health and safety responsibilities, identifying hazards and develop safe work practices, taking some leadership in developing and implementing an occupational health and safety program, and making sure we understand the concept of due diligence. We will discuss that very often over the course of the next couple hours. So we're going to begin with part 1, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And we're going to be looking at it from the perspective of employers, managers, supervisors, workers, and the government, and how each one of those parties all have responsibility when it comes to workplace health and safety. We're going to be looking at the rights of workers as it pertains to the right to refuse unsafe work, participate in health and safety activities, and know about the dangers in the workplace. So we're going to start with a quick case study. So in this case, an 18-year-old worker who'd been on the job for only 6 or 7 hours fell at least 20 feet and broke his wrist and 2 vertebrae. He'd been working on roof trusses that were 20 to 25 feet off the ground. He had not received any training, and there was no fall protection equipment provided. The customer tried to blame the worker's fall on his untied boots. So the case study here is we want to pretend that we were the temporary employment agency that placed this worker. What are a couple things that we would have done to prevent this event from happening? Does anyone have any answers? Okay, so discussing a few of the things that we're going to talk about. Would we have even considered this client? So the question is this a client we would have wanted to do business with? And the first approach the client had is this person fell, and the initial blame was on the employee for their untied boots. So I think in this case, we would want to consider that this client may have not been the most ideal client. One of the things we could have looked at was, did we have an accurate job description as a temporary employment agency? Did we truly understand what the job was that this person was going to be employed in? Did we understand what the client's safety rules and regulations and procedures and processes were? And did we actually do our due diligence in understanding that? The other thing we want to take a look at is this work was done by an 18-year-old worker. And 18-year-old workers are classified as young or new workers under the occupational health and safety process. What that means is they have limited experience, whether it is because of their age or whether it is because they are a new immigrant to the country. They may not understand the same set of rules and regulations of the Canadian landscape, or may not have the experience within the same. So they may not quite understand what it is that is required of them or what they're able to take a look at. And just I noticed the chat section, make sure PPE was worn. Absolutely. That is another hazard in this case. There is a requirement anytime work is done over 10 feet to provide working at height training, as Navneet mentioned. And it sounds in this case, based on the lack of PPE and the lack of training involved, that wasn't followed. So those three things really, we didn't have an accurate job description. We had a new worker, new to the workforce, as well as improper training. When we take a look at the experience of the worker and the lack of training, we don't view this as a very good employer to do business with. And we'll kind of go through some steps to deal with that and to make sure that we are working with customers and clients that are of the same safety mindset that we are. The Occupational Health and Safety and Regulations legislation in Canada outlines the general rights and responsibilities of the employer, the supervisor, and the worker. And we're going to be talking about that a lot in the next couple slides. So we're going to be looking at the different parties involved with making sure that people are safe in the workplace with regards to operating in a temporary employment agency landscape. We'll take a look. Women has critical injury, designated substances, industrial establishments, and first aid. And the one important thing that we need to understand is that there are 14 jurisdictions in Canada. So there's one federal jurisdiction, there are 10 provincial, there's 3 territorial, and each one of those has its own health and safety and occupational health and safety legislation. Federal legislation is something that is important for the temporary employment agency to understand with regards to what their client is. So you may be based in Ontario and operate fully within the Ontario occupational health and safety landscape, but you may be supplying workers to a client that is federally regulated. That client is going to have the requirements of federal legislation for every person placed there. So what that means is if you're supplying labor to someone that is federally regulated, you have to make sure that the roles and responsibilities, the training, and all the health and safety requirements are satisfied at the federal level. So just because you're Ontario based, because you're supplying the client to a federally regulated jurisdictional client, you're required to supply the necessary training and requirements for each employee's service there. So what is provincially or federally regulated? Provincially regulated is 90% of all businesses. It's manufacturing, it's industry, it's probably most of the clients that you have. Federally regulated clients, however, can include the federal government, which can include airports, banks, bridges, radio and broadcasting jobs, grain elevators, feed mills, highway transportation, pipelines, railways, shipping and shipping services. I always look at it this way. A federally regulated customer or client is generally one that does their jobs across provinces. So if you take a look at, for example, a truck driver, they may be traveling from Quebec to Saskatchewan. And more likely than not, that transportation company would be federally regulated because they're crossing provincial boundaries. The important takeaway for us is we want to make sure that if we are supplying clients that could be federally regulated, we make sure that we ask that question of the client. We want to be prepared in terms of providing the necessary training for any person that we are supplying to a federally regulated company. So OSA aims to do a few things. We want to make sure that we are advocating and promoting the employees' health and safety and well-being in the workplace. We want to encourage employees' participation in maintaining and improving health and safety. We want to prevent risks in health and safety in the workplace. We want to involve employees through representation on committees. And we want to ensure expert advice and resources are available. So our role in this is we do want to participate in health and safety meetings. We want to make sure that we are onboarding and training contract and temporary employees under their OSHA regulations. And that's what I was just discussing between provincially regulated and federally regulated. We want to maintain and improve existing training opportunities and ensure on-site health and safety inspections reviews are done on a regular basis. We have a multiple choice question here. I complete a workplace safety site inspection with every new customer prior to sending an employee out to work on the assignment. Do I do this all the time with no exceptions? About 90% of the time, usually about half the time. Usually after they start working, I'll book time to go on site. None of the time as my employee tells me whether it is safe or not. So if you can record your answer in the chat box and we'll just discuss. So we have A, and A is probably the best answer. Every agency, especially ones that are involved with ACSESS and their health and safety groups, have a process for client inspections. Every company calls them something different. Some call them client inspections, some call them risk analysis, some call them safety inspections. Whatever it is, it's important that you have a process in place for inspecting the clients. And you want to have the process to go on site to your client and find out, okay, what are their health and safety processes like? Do they have everything that is required for us to supply labor to them in a safe and efficient manner? And your best bet, your biggest safety mission that you're looking for in this is to ensure that you're going out to look at the clients before you're sending employees. I look at this from the perspective of I want to ensure the safety of the employees that I send there. And I look at it from the perspective of myself. Would I send someone that I know there? Would I send a child my child, my spouse, my aunt, my uncle, my grandparent? Would I send them into that work environment? And if you wouldn't send that person into the work environment, you may want to reconsider whether or not you do business with that particular customer. So who is responsible for what? We kind of discussed this in a previous slide. We have a number of parties responsible in terms of health and safety. We have workers, we have the customer, we have the supervisor, and we have the staffing agency. When it comes to health and safety worker, every one of these parties play a key role in maintaining a safe work environment. And we do that through training, we do that through education, we do that through awareness, and we do that through expanding upon the knowledge of what is expected of the person in the role. Now, our industry does have a unique relationship regarding health and safety, whereas the intersection of all these parties have to come together for the overall protection of the worker. When you're dealing with that many parties, it's important to make sure that you're understanding and have put out in writing or some agreement with your client about who is training for what. Perfect example, which we'll get into later, is WMIS. WMIS training is generally, as an industry practice, we do one part of the WMIS training. We generally, I think in 99% of the cases of the temporary employment agencies that I've been involved with, will ensure that the client themselves are training on the specific chemicals being worked on, or being utilized within the client work site. So it's really important to understand who is responsible in those cases. You don't want to be in a situation where an accident happens and the agency is saying, well, that's the training that the client should do. And the client at that point is saying the agency should have trained on this. At that point, it's too late, and you're going to be faced with an occupational health and safety labor inspector, or you could potentially get fines from the government, depending on your province. And at that point, you don't want to be in a situation where, two different parties are pointing the fingers at who's responsible. We have another multiple choice question. Who advises workers of hazards in the workplace and their specific role and provides written instructions where prescribed? Is it the customer? Is it the worker? Is it the staffing agency? Or is it the supervisor? Please just put A, B, C, or D in the chat, and we'll discuss once all the results are in. So we have a couple different results. We have an A, we have a D, or all of them. So that's an interesting perspective. And I guess this is covered in a subsequent slide. Who provides the written instruction about the specific role? And the best answer in this case is the supervisor. So it's the supervisor that is required under the occupational health and safety legislation to provide very specific things, including information, which we'll get into, about working safely in the workplace. An important question that comes up, especially in our industry, is who is the supervisor? Is it the supervisor at the client? Is it a person within your office that's the supervisor? And the answer under health and safety legislation is it could be both. In most cases, it is both. People could be considered supervisors. Both parties are giving instructions. Both parties are saying when you have to show up. Both parties are saying what PPE is required. And under health and safety legislation, more likely than not, they'll probably look at both those people as being supervisors. Therefore, we as the agency have very specific requirements, which we'll get into in a moment. What are the responsibilities of our customers? They have to make sure that the equipment, materials, and all the protective devices are provided, maintained, and used as prescribed in the workplace. So they have to make sure the machinery and all the equipment used is safe, operational, and protected by specific guarding if necessary. There must be a copy of OSA posted in the workplace. There has to be information, instruction, supervision provided to all workers. Customer must assign a competent person when selecting a supervisor. Customer must have in place a written, annually reviewed health and safety policy and program. Customer has to take every precaution reasonable in all circumstances for the protection of workers. Number 6 is something that we will discuss a number of times. The legislation for workplaces is fairly vague. The government doesn't tell you have to do X, Y, and Z in your business. What they do say is a very high capturing statement such as this. Customer has to take every precaution reasonable in all circumstances for the protection of workers. So regardless whether or not a very specific thing is spelled out in legislation or not, if an injury happens, and a very serious injury, many times, and one of the most often cited charges under the Occupational Health and Safety Act is that one, not taking every precaution reasonable. What are the responsibilities of a joint health and safety committee? Joint health and safety committees, they are made up of the employee group and the management group, generally at the customer or the client site. And they have a number of responsibilities. They identify and evaluate hazards. They participate in programs to protect safety and health. They take a look at employee complaints and suggestions with regards to safety and health. They take a look at injury and work hazard reports. monitor and follow up hazard reports and recommended action, participate in safety and health inquiries and investigations. So if something major happens, the Joint Health and Safety Committee is almost always involved. They participate in resolving workplace refusals and work stoppages. They make recommendations. And lastly, they monitor the effectiveness of safety programs and procedures. Responsibilities of the workplace supervisor. The supervisor ensures that the workers abide by the Act and regulations and wears prescribed PPE equipment and clothing. They have to advise the workers of the hazards in the workplace and their role and provide written instruction where required. And the supervisor takes every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of the worker. Remember back 2 slides ago where I mentioned that. That is ingrained in the occupational health and safety legislation that supervisors have to be the foreperson to that requirement of taking every reasonable precaution necessary. What are the responsibilities of the agency? So that's us. When we take a look at the parties, what are we required to do? And interesting enough, you're going to find that these responsibilities are almost exactly the same as the client. The occupational health and safety doesn't really draw a line between the client and the agency as much as they could. It's definitely changing now based on more recent sort of investigations and so forth by the Ministry of Labor and so forth. But what you're going to find your responsibilities, so you have to provide your training under OSA and Provincial Compensation Acts. You got to ensure that protective devices when provided by the agency or worker, such as boots, eye protection, are maintained and used as prescribed in the workplace. So you do have that requirement. You have to ensure that workers abide by the Act and the regulations and wear the prescribed PPEs, equipment, and clothing, provide required training on any of the prescribed PPEs. And you have to make sure that a copy of OSA is posted in the workplace. So if you remember the responsibilities of the customer, very, very similar. So what are the rights of your workers? Now, these rights are shared by every worker in Canada. And it does not matter if they are a temporary worker, a contract worker, doesn't matter if they're full-time. Everyone has the same rights and duties. So in this case, both the agency and the client have employer duties under the law to protect your health and safety. Using appropriate methods of communication for all employees when you are doing this includes special needs such as Braille, large print, audio tape, sign language, and oral communication. And that's one of those things that you have to understand when you are providing training. We will take a look at the 3 different rights here. So the first one, the right to know. So you have a right to know what hazards are present in the workplace and be given the information, training, supervision you need to protect yourself. A very easy example I give is peanut allergies. Everyone knows someone that, whether it's yourself or a family member or a friend of a friend, a lot of people have peanut allergies at this point. If you're supplying a client to a food manufacturer and they are dealing with peanuts, it is very important before you send an employee to that work site to let them know that there are peanuts being used in that facility. Same as if it was a work environment where there was very heavy lifting or it was very dusty. If there are very specific hazards of that customer, it is the right of the employee to know about those hazards. The right to participate is the right in which you participate in the Joint Health and Safety Committee, which we discussed a few slides back. And the idea is, as mentioned previously, it's made up of employers and management, and they have to have 1 member of each, depending on the size of employees. The idea is you have 2 parties working together to ensure the safety of the work environment. And that right is bestowed upon every worker in Canada to participate in that sort of continuous improvement of the workplace. Lastly, you have the right to refuse. So all employees have the right to refuse work that is unsafe, work that could be dangerous to themselves or even coworkers, or if there is violence possible in the workplace. And we're going to go through the right to refuse in a few slides. But these 3 basic rights are enshrined for every worker. Doesn't matter where you are. Health and safety is essentially built upon these 3 basic rights. So another multiple choice question. What should you do? When should you do site-specific hazard safety assessment at a new customer site? Should you do it prior to the assignment starting, within the first 48 hours of the assignment starting, prior to the assignment starting, or if new hazards have been introduced to a worksite, prior to the assignment starting, or P when conditions of the worksite changes, C, or lastly, F, A, C, and D. Please go ahead and record your answer. So we have a couple. Yeah, both answers are F. So that's perfect. The answer is we want to do site-specific hazard or safety assessment, risk analysis, whatever it is that your company calls it. We want to do it before an assignment starts. So it's no use after you send out an employee to the work site to go and see the work site at that point, whether it's safe or not. You want to make sure you're doing that before the first placement. You want to make sure that you're doing it prior to the assignments starting, or if new hazards are being presented. So if they put a new machine in and you're going to be supplying labor to that machine, or if all of a sudden you are just supplying to the office in terms of the office staff, and now your client would like a forklift driver, you may want to go out and see that work environment where the forklift driver is going to be assigned to. And lastly, prior to the assignment starting, repeat when conditions at the work site changes. So I discussed that when you're assigning a new work site or new hazards. I'm going to be switching gears, and we're going to be talking about WHMIS, essentially known as the Global Harmonized System. So what do we need to know? We're going to take a look at the history of WHMIS. We're going to be looking at some of the product classifications, hazard identification, labeling requirements, SDS, materials, provincial and federal regulations, and worker rights. This is what's known as the right to know legislation and applies to hazardous products. And there's several pieces of legislation collectively called WHMIS. It is a comprehensive plan for providing information on hazardous materials intended for use in workplaces. WHMIS applies in all Canadian workplaces, which are covered by occupational health and safety legislation, and where WHMIS controlled products are used. And one of the important things is compliance is critical. It's truly something that is made to protect the health and safety of all employees, all workers on that work site. Taking a brief look at the history of WHMIS, WHMIS is, I wouldn't say fairly new, like about 40 years old, 45 years old, I guess, at this point. And they started looking at it in the 70s. They had a number of injuries, they had a number of problems, and they had a lot of chemicals being introduced in the workplace. And essentially, they called a working group of the Occupational Safety and Health Committee of the Canadian Association of Administrators of Labor Legislation. So a big acronym to have a group that was started to look at it and say, look, we're having a lot of problems with material in the workplace, hazardous material in the workplace, and we want to develop a system that assists us in making sure that employees are safe. November 1979. Anyone that is in Ontario may remember or may have seen pictures of the Mississauga train derailment. And what happened there was an explosion and release of toxic gases, and it ultimately affected it required the evacuation of 200,000 people. So anytime a major event happens, it kind of kickstarts, especially in health and safety. You know, there is a major event, and then everyone feels we have to, or rightfully so in this case, has to start taking a look at making sure things are safer than they have been. So that major event, the train derailment, really kicked things off. And in May of 1980, they had the introduction of transportation of dangerous goods. May of 1981, they had a government task force formed to study the feasibility of labeling hazardous materials. Fast forward to 1985, there was when WHMIS, the Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System report of the Project Steering Committee was released. And that truly kicked off WHMIS as we know it. So it was implementation in 1988 on a national basis. And WHMIS every year is updated because we have new products, new processes, new procedures, and so forth in terms of dealing with hazardous products. And it proceeded from 1988 up until 2015, when WHMIS was reintroduced to meet with a more global demand. And effectively, we call it WHMIS 2015, but essentially it's just called WHMIS at this point. It's been in place for 9 years. Each one of you on the call today probably conducts, I would safely assume you conduct WHMIS training within your offices, so you are familiar with it. What was the intent of the global harmonized system? So we talked about WHMIS before. Every country had their own general classification process, whether it was similar to WHMIS or not. And the governments of the time, because we are living on a global stage now, business is international. You're dealing with, you're getting supplies from Europe and as well as Mexico and South Asia. Businesses now are dealing on a worldwide basis. So the idea was global harmonized system will help facilitate trade by eliminating multiple classification systems and enhance protection of human health by using standard and consistent messaging. So what does that mean? That means essentially you want to be sure that a product you're using, whether you're using it in Europe or Canada, it has the same classification system. So the governments at the time, working up to 2015, meshed those systems. And the example on the right is one of those reasons why this occurred. So previous to 2015, this is the same product. So you had a product that was used that in Canada, US, Japan, and Korea was listed as toxic. In the EU, Australia, Malaysia, and Thailand, it was listed as harmful. China listed the same substance, exact same substance, there's no difference to it, as moderately toxic. New Zealand said it was hazardous, and India said it was non-toxic. So we got to remember it's the same substance being used. And as a worker, you want to be very assured that the product you're dealing with, you understand the risks and responsibilities of dealing with that product. So the government has rightfully harmonized the system when you're dealing with, it doesn't matter what customer you're dealing with or what client you're dealing with. If you're getting a product from India, New Zealand, China, EU, Australia, Canada, or the US, we want to be sure that it's classified the same. We're going to skip this slide because we don't need to look at the 5 areas of change. One of the elements of WHMIS is it has what are called pictograms. And the example that we're looking at has a number of pictures. So we have the exploding bomb, we have a flame, skull and crossbones, exclamation mark. And what those are very easily digestible things. You can see these pictograms on a substance or a container for a substance that you're dealing with and quickly understand that there are specific hazards associated with it. So essentially, pictograms are graphic images that immediately show the user a hazardous product, what type of hazard is present. And with a very quick glance, you can see that the product is, for example, flammable, or it might be a health hazard. Most pictograms have a distinctive red square set on one of its points. And each one of these 9 examples at the top have that. The other example, the biohazardous, does not actually have that. But together, the symbol and the border are referred to as a pictogram. And pictograms are assigned to specific hazard classes or categories. Now, the nice thing about the pictograms are that they typically look like the hazard that it is. So, for example, flame has a flame on it. You very quickly understood that, that could be a flame. Corrosion pictogram easily depicts a corrosive sort of substance acting on whatever that picture is, a board and a hand. So regardless of whether English is your first language or not, you can very quickly pick that up and see that pictogram. And the idea is to make it easy enough that, anyone can understand that there is a hazard, and perhaps I should go speak to my supervisor about how to deal with that hazard. There are 2 specific hazard groups within WHMIS. There's a physical hazard group, which is based on the physical or chemical properties of the product. And we kind of discussed those of flammability, reactivity, or corrosivity to metals. So those are the physical things that are happening from the chemical. The second part of it is the health hazards group. And that's based on the ability of the products to cause a health effect. And that would be what the human or what the person actually feels from the substance. It could be eye irritation, respiratory sensitization, asthma, could cause cancer. So they break it up into what are the actual physical thing happening to the substance, or what is it doing, and what is the effect on the person. We have a number of hazard classes here. Hazard classes are a way of grouping together products that have similar properties. Most of the hazard classes are common to GHS and will be used worldwide by all countries that have adopted GHS. There are some that are only specific to WHMIS 2015 because the Canadian government has deemed them so. But when you're looking at the physical hazards, some examples would be flammable gases, flammable aerosols, flammable liquids, self-heating substances and mixtures. And then when you're looking at what the health hazards are, again, those are the effects of the actual person: acute toxicity, skin corrosion, germ cell carcinogen, something that is cancer causing, reproductive toxicity, aspiration hazard, and health hazards not otherwise classified. We have another question: labeling, true or false? Labeling materials is a way health hazard information is made available to users. And although it is not required by law, it is recommended that all hazard materials be labeled. Is that true or false? Please record your answer in the chat. Again, read it quickly. It is not required by law. It is recommended that all hazard materials be labeled. So is that true or false? I have a number of false, which is the best answer. Yeah, absolutely. It is false. Labels are required by women's laws. One of these tricky questions is not required by law in the question, but it is required by women's law. So in Canada, WHMIS is one of the ways health hazard information is made available to anyone using the material. Labels are very important because they are the first alert that there may be hazards associated with using the product, especially if it's covered by WHMIS legislation. The other thing that labels do is they also tell us what precautions to take when using the product and direct the person to the SDS sheets available for more detailed information on the product. So we have another multiple choice question. What is the purpose of labeling? Labels tell us what precautions to take when using. Labels are required under government regulations. You can relabel at any time when there's no change in substance. It tells it that there's additional information on the SDS. All the above, or F, A, B, and D. Please go ahead and record your answer in the chat. So the best answer here is F. Labels tell us a couple things, but primarily they tell us what precautions to take when using it. Second, they are required under government regulation, so that's the WHMIS regulation themselves. And it tells you that there's additional information on the SDS. And we'll get into what those look like in a second. So if we're taking a look at WHMIS labels, there are two different types of labels. We're going to take a look at the first one, the supplier label. Supplier labels have a number of key common elements, or requirements rather. The language. Here in Canada, the language, it must be in English and French, both official languages. Has to have a product identifier. So that is the brand name, the chemical name, what's the common name. What is that product? What is that hazardous product? They have to have the initial supplier identifier. So that is the name, address, telephone number of either the manufacturer, the Canadian manufacturer, or the Canadian importer. So if someone has imported that from another country, they are the initial supplier identifier. So if you have a major accident or major event, the emergency personnel need to know who to contact to find out how to deal with that appropriately. Has to have a pictogram, so that we discussed that. Hazard symbol with red square set on one of its points. Has to have a signal word. So danger or warning. Danger is used for high hazard, while warning is used for less severe hazards. Has to have a hazard statement, which I'll show you what those are in a second, but they're standardized phrases which describe the nature of the hazard. Precautionary statement. Easily digested, standardized phrases that describe the measures taken to minimize or prevent adverse effects. How do you deal with it? How do you protect yourself? And lastly, supplemental label information will include precautionary actions, hazards not yet included in the GHS, physical state or route of exposure. So this is an example of the supplier label. And what we have is the product identifier. So the name is the product K1. We have our pictogram. We have a signal word, which is danger in this case. We have our hazard statement, fatal if swallowed, causes skin irritation. We have our precautionary statements. Items like wear protective gloves, do not eat or drink when smoke when using this product, store locked up. And then at the bottom, we have the supplier or the distributor. Again, that's who we contact if there is a major event. So the suppliers are responsible for labeling women's control products that they provide to customers. The customer and sometimes the workers are all responsible for labeling or relabeling products in the workplace as per the occupational health and safety legislation. So I mentioned before that there's two sets of labels. So the supplier label, again, it's provided by either the distributor or importer rather, or the actual manufacturer of the substance. The second example is a workplace label. There is no requirement for how a workplace label must look. A workplace label has three basic requirements, though. You want to have the product name. So what is this product? In this case, it's acetone. You want to have the safe handling precautions. It can include a pictogram, can include supplier label information. How do you deal with it safely? And then you always want to have a reference to the SDS. So someone knows that if they're using this product and it is covered under WMIS, that there will be SDS sheets available. So you want to draw your attention to that. So when is a workplace label required? It's required when a hazardous product is produced at the workplace and used in that workplace. So if you're producing the same substance and using it in that workplace, but not necessarily transmitting it, you can use a workplace label. If a hazardous product is decanted, so essentially if you're taking it from, for example, a large drum and putting it into a more manageable, say a spray bottle, where it's going to be used on the floor. And lastly, if a supplier label becomes lost or illegible, or you can't read it. So there are two situations where a workplace label is not necessary, and that's where a container or where a substance is poured into a container and it's going to be used immediately. So if it's not going to sit on the shelf, if I'm pouring, say, 10 milliliters of the substance, and I'm going to use that immediately in my course of work, I don't have to put a workplace label on it. Or second, if under the control of the person who decanted it. And that means if I take the product from the large container and I put it into the smaller spray bottle, and I know I'm going to use the contents of that spray bottle within my work shift, and it's not going to leave my site, I'm the one that's going to be using it. In those two cases, you don't have to use a workplace label. It doesn't necessarily mean you don't want to, but you're not required under WMIS law. So what's a hazard statement? We discussed this a few moments ago. Each hazard class or category has an assigned hazard statement. Hazard statements are brief. They're generally standardized sentences that tell you more about the exact hazard of the product. The statements are short, but they describe the most significant hazards of the product. Some examples would be extremely flammable gas, or contains gas under pressure, may explode if heated, fatal if inhaled, may cause cancer. The wording of the hazard statement helps to describe the degree of the hazard. For example, may cause cancer is more hazardous than suspected of causing cancer. We have another multiple choice. What does SDS stand for under WMIS 2015? Safety data sheets, safety directive sheets, safety decree sheets, safety dictate sheets. Yeah, perfect. Safety data sheets. So that's the best answer. What does safety data sheet stand for? It's a document that contains information on the potential hazards. So it could be health, could be fire, reactivity, environmental, and how to work safely with the chemical product. In Canada, every material that is controlled by WMIS must have an accompanying SDS that is specific to each individual product or material. And that includes the product name and supplier on the SDS must match the material used. It's important to understand that SDS are prepared by the supplier or the manufacturer. It's not the consumer of the product. So it's not the manufacturer who purchased the chemical from another manufacturer. It is who created the substance or who imported it into Canada. SDS sheets are, one of the pillars that a good safety program is developed on. And the important thing to understand as a temporary employment agency, you want to be, again, I keep saying this, but you want to be dealing with customers that are as safe as you are. You want to ensure that you're supplying people that are going to go there and operate in a safe manner. And I suggest when you are doing your safety inspection or risk analysis or whatever your client inspection is, that if it is a manufacturer, you ask the question, do you use WMIS controlled products? And if the answer is yes, you want to make sure that they have safety data sheets. You want to make sure that things are labeled. You want to make sure that they are telling your people, your employees who you're under care and control of, how to work with them and how to work with them in a safe manner. So what does a WMS worker education program, what does it require? We've kind of gone through what it requires already during the course of today's presentation. You need labels, you need an SDS sheets, hazard information, procedures, handling, storage, disposal, and emergency procedures. So the question, who needs to be educated on this? And the law is very specific. It requires that employers educate a worker exposed or likely to be exposed to a controlled product. And specifically, an exposed worker is any worker who stores, handles, uses, or disposes of a controlled product, or who supervises another worker performing these activities. And is follow-up testing required? That's an interesting question. We get that very often within my own company that we work with. Yes, you do have to do retraining on WMIS. It is something that you want to have built into your safety program. You want to be doing this yearly and have it documented. So if your agency is the one performing the training, make sure that you have the test, make sure you have the information and that you're containing it with the employee file through whatever HR system you use or program, or hard copy, whatever it is that your specific company does. You want to make sure that you're retaining that information. So let's take a look at what some employee responsibilities are with regards to WMIS. Workers must participate in their education and training sessions. So they have to actually attend the training sessions. They have to follow the safe work procedures, including while at a customer site. They need to work in compliance with the Act. They need to wear the prescribed PPE equipment and clothing and report any hazards or defects. So the employees are not without responsibilities in this program. They have to operate safely. They have to attend training. They have to make sure they're wearing PPE. They can't just disregard that information, especially if someone gets hurt. You want to have the documentation that you train the person on doing it, and that for whatever reason they say weren't wearing their PPE or they weren't following their process and procedures with regards to that controlled substance. So this is about the halfway point of the presentation today. We're gonna take let's say a 4-minute break. Just enough to get up. I'm gonna start it again in 4 minutes, so at 1:52, at least my time, and we will begin again. 4 minutes, yeah. So 1:52 Eastern Standard Time. Hi, so welcome back. We're going to be looking at hazards in the workplace. And hazards, they can be found well, essentially in every workplace, and they come from a wide variety or range of sources. We're going to be looking at some of the more common workplace hazards and how to eliminate or control them. We're going to be taking a look at this. So this is a case study, and it's important to understand why we look at hazards. And what are some of the rationale or some of the thoughts that surround us as temporary employment agencies supplying workers to essentially third-party customers. So in this case, we had three workers. They were working in an asbestos abatement project at a single-family home. The abatement area was enclosed, and in that area, certain asbestos-containing materials had been removed, and there was asbestos dust hazards present. Ministry of Labor inspector attended and conducted an inspection. The inspector found one of the workers exiting the enclosed area wearing street clothing. Two other workers were found inside the enclosed area not wearing protective clothing. One was performing cleanup, and the other was securing bags filled with asbestos-containing material. Essentially, the client was charged, and they pled guilty to failing to ensure that only persons wearing PPE and equipment enter a work area where there is asbestos dust hazard. They were fined $25,000. This was in 2015. The Ontario government has upped the fines for occupational health and safety incidences greatly since that point. And in this case, lastly, the supervisor was fined $4,000 after pleading guilty. So, what are some of the challenges in this? If we look at this from a temporary employment perspective, we can see that the client was clearly negligent. The client was not performing their due diligence. And anyone that knows asbestos, or at least has heard asbestos, it's a concerning substance. No one really wants to be exposed to it. And the strange thing with asbestos is there is no safe working limit to it. In a lot of cases with chemicals or substances, the human body can be exposed to certain amounts of it. The government does not define what that is for asbestos. There is even a minute exposure to asbestos can cause health hazards to people. So it's not like you have to consume a whole bunch of it or inhale, in most cases, a whole bunch of it. In this case, where we look at the details of this case, we see that the employees were not wearing protective clothing. That is one of the requirements for dealing with asbestos. They're wearing street clothing, and the problem with it, street clothing is the asbestos sticks to the clothing. So the idea is you want to have a suit over top that you take off when you're leaving the site, so you're not bringing asbestos home. So the question for this particular case study, I'll go through it a little bit, is what would you do if filling this order for your customer? And I liken back to some of the topics we've discussed already. We should have done a risk analysis. We should have been at this customer and find out, okay, what are the safety protocols? Do we understand what the role is? Did we know we were supplying workers to an asbestos project, or did we believe we were just sending general laborers to, a restoration company? That's probably the first failure of the agency. The other one is ensuring that the process and procedures of the client were being met, and that they were, in the case of if we were supplying as workers to an asbestos abatement, we didn't ensure that those procedures were being followed, such as wearing the necessary PPE, such as all the other requirements of asbestos, and they're very specific in terms of how much asbestos is present. Taking a look at some hidden dangers, and the question is, what are designated substances? So a designated substance is defined by OSHA as a couple things. It's a biological agent, chemical agent, could be a physical agent, or it could be a combination of the above. Hazards and substances are typically or can be hidden in the workplace, home, schools, and even products we use. So some workers encounter hazardous substances by surprise when performing routine tasks. And we want to make sure that we understand that just because they are by surprise, it doesn't mean that we did not have to have the necessary precautions in place for them. So there is a separate regulation for 11 chemical agents that have been classified as designated substances here in Ontario. Other provinces have similar legislation, or they may not define it as such. They may have a broader definition. In Ontario, we have what's called the Designated Substances Regulation, and it regulates exposure to designated substances in the workplace and outlines several ways to control the hazards posed by those substances. So what are some of these? So as we said, there's 11 substances. They're defined here. So arsenic, asbestos, benzene, ethyl oxide. When a designated substance is present in the workplace, the supervisor must complete an assessment of the use. The assessment is to determine if a health hazard exists for workers and whether or not to a control program is required. The supervisor assessment has to include the following information on use, handling, storage, and disposal, actual and potential exposure of workers to the substance, and methods and procedures required to control that exposure. So being from the temporary employment world, I instantly think, how are we dealing with this with our clients? And it all comes back to the client inspection. We need to make sure that if they are dealing with substances that are labeled as designated substances by the Ontario government, that we understand what our risk is if we're supplying to that area. So our employee is going to be exposed and what that exposure looks like. So it's called Regulation 490/09 designated substances. It identifies the requirements if those substances are present in the workplace. So we as temporary employment agencies want to understand, is it present in the workplace of our client? The employer must review the work methods and assess the likelihood of worker exposure. So again, that comes back to this site inspection. Are our workers going to be exposed? And if there is any exposure, you have to have a control program that includes controls, practices, hygiene practices, record keeping, and medical surveillance if applicable. Generally, a joint health and safety committee has to be consulted. So again, when we're supplying workers in a temporary fashion to these clients, we need to be very concerned if they are dealing with any of these designated substances. So some of the uses of these substances, the first one is used primarily in the safety as the starting monomer in the manufacturing of synthetic polymers such as acrylic fabrics found in carpets. Arsenic is a strong poison. It's used as wood preservative, insecticides, and herbicides. Arsenic is used in alloys of copper and lead. Asbestos, we did discuss that in the previous slide. The thing with asbestos, it's in a lot of material, basically from the mid 80s earlier. That could include insulation, wallboard, asphalt, adhesives, caulking, ceiling and floor tiles, gaskets, drywall, compound, plaster, and roofing shingles. Asbestos was used, it was essentially a miracle substance before we really understood the health effects of it, basically mid-70s, 1976, where we stopped manufacture of it. Benzene makes other chemicals which are used to make plastic, resin, nylon, rubber, lubricants, detergents, drugs, and pesticides. Ethyl oxide is the manufacture of ethylene glycol, surfactants, fumigants, fungicides, and petroleum demulsifiers. Coke oven emissions are the airborne products or byproducts created by destructive distillation of coal and petroleum. So when essentially they're burned, the emissions can occur from the production of steel, from petroleum products, and from the lining of high temperature furnaces. Isocyanates, typically used, most commonly used rather in spray foam, insulation, sealants, finishes, paint, and auto body materials. And lead is typically found in old paint, old mortar, water pipes, lead sheathing, and contaminated soil. Mercury is found in fluorescent lights, switches, pressure gauges, electrodes, and contaminated soil. Silica is typically found in bricks and blocks, granite, abrasives, concrete, sandstone, cement, and mortar. It's particularly problematic when it is airborne. So if someone is cutting it or it's being crushed, otherwise being put up into the air. And lastly, vinyl chloride is used in the manufacture of polyvinyl chloride or PVC, which is used in furniture, upholstery, and many plastic products, including plastic pipes, wire, and cable coating. So that's a lot of information. Again, I strongly recommend one of your site inspection questions for new clients is asking if they have a program for designated substances if they're using them, and then find out what the effect for your company is. As you can see from some of the examples, designated substances are in our day in life. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are catastrophic. It does mean that they have to be monitored, they have to be handled safely, and we do have to have necessary precautions for employees who are dealing with the substances on a more concentrated basis. They're dealing with it every day, let's say, whereas a consumer may not actually be that exposed to the designated substances. I'm going to be taking a look at some other hazards in the workplace. First one, confined spaces. So confined spaces are areas not fit for normal human occupancy. They can include silos, vats, hoppers, tanks, sewers, pipes, uh, rail cars, aircraft wings, boilers, manholes. Ditches and trenches may also be a confined space when access or egress is limited. And a confined space has a number of requirements in almost every jurisdiction in Canada. You have to be really concerned when supplying labor to confined space to ensure that you're partnering with a client that is as safety minded as you. There's methods for monitoring the person in the confined space. You have to have means of getting that person out of the confined space if they were to, say, pass out. You have to monitor the entire situation as well as have a plan in place. In most jurisdictions, sometimes it slightly changes, but those are the overall rules for confined space. Again, you want to make sure if a client calls you up and says, I want someone to work confined space and clean out inside of a milk tank, let's say, you get transport milk tank truck tanker. You want to make sure that you're comfortable with that and that, again, the client has necessary health and safety processes in place. Indoor air quality is the second common hazard. Common issues with indoor air quality is typically improper and inadequately maintained HVAC systems, so heating, cooling, ventilation. A lot of times it can be from contamination by construction. So if there's some sort of renovation going inside your office and all sorts of dust and silica and other stuff is being made airborne. They also can arise from one of the more following causes. So if there's poor temperature, humidity, lighting, there's contaminants. Again, if there's construction going on or your neighbor and you don't have sealed walls, let's say, and they manufacture substances and all of a sudden now you're smelling things. Indoor air quality is so important. One of the things we do as humans the most is we breathe. And, we could breathe up to 60 times a minute, even more so with some people. So you're constantly breathing air into your body. You want to make sure that the air quality where you're working is satisfactory for general human health and occupancy. The third hazard we have is lasers. The problem with lasers, they can cause burns. So eye burns, skin burns, where the laser beam shines on the person. So if it's shone in someone's eye and it's sufficiently powerful enough, it could cause blindness or eye issues. And if it's significantly powerful enough and shone on someone's skin, it could burn them. Some of the non-beam hazards associated with lasers can include the fumes emitted from materials being exposed to laser beams. So if you're not necessarily exposed to the laser beam itself as it's burning through the product, that product is fuming or smoking and you're ingesting it. Surgical procedures are another one of the things. So anyone in the healthcare, if they're doing laser work or surgeries, let's say, involved with lasers, there is definitely a hazard involved with that. Fourth example is scents and temperatures. So scents, we usually mean smells or odors from either cosmetics or a person or a product the person is using. Sometimes scents are more for some people. Some people have scent reactions or allergies, or they're very sensitive to scents. It's not just unpleasant, like someone has microwaved, something that doesn't smell very good. For some people, you can have a very visceral reaction to scents. For example, it can cause adverse health effects such as headaches, dizziness, nausea. It can be very serious for some people. For other people, it may not affect them in the same way. The other one, temperature. Temperature is an interesting one. Everyone complains about temperature. The number one complaint for offices, for people that work in offices, is temperature. You always have some people who think it's either too hot or too cold. One of the things with occupational health and safety, though, is a hot environment is not actually covered. They don't, no jurisdiction that I believe in, that I believe they define a hot temperature. It's more covered under, so the government doesn't say, after 25 degrees Celsius, you have to do certain things. It's more under the general duty clause. So there's no maximum temperature specified, but it does specify cold temperatures. So you do have to have specific measures in place for a cold environment because of the possibility of things like hyperthermia and frostbite. So for now, in most jurisdictions, cold temperatures are deemed by Occupational Health and Safety Act as problematic and requiring specific measures in place.
I have a
For our
question.
industry, the example would be people working outdoors. So in Canada, it's can get very cold in the winter and fall and spring. Or people that are working, say, refrigerated areas. So a forklift driver, if they're coming in and out of, say, outside, or they're going into a refrigerated freezer area, we do have to make sure that necessary precautions and procedures are in place. Number 5 is ventilation. Ventilation is the mechanical system in a building that brings in fresh outdoor air and removes the contaminated indoor air. So in a workplace, ventilation uses to control exposure to airborne contaminants by removing fumes, dust, and vapors in order to provide a healthy and safe working environment. I think we were all very attuned to ventilation as we were coming out of COVID in recent years. There was a lot of air purifiers and whatnot put into employer areas, and we were all very concerned about the air quality as well as ensuring that we weren't unnecessarily breathing in things that could be filtered out. Number 7, we're all aware weather. We're in Canada. Weather is absolutely a hazard. You could have lightning, you have cold, you could have hot, you could have rain, and all those things at once. So it's 100% a hazard. We do have to manage it, but it is very much something that is part of the Canadian experience. Our last hazard that we're going to discuss today is working alone. It's not always hazardous to work alone. It is something that can be dependent on the conditions of the work environment. So a situation that is high or low risk is going to depend on the location, the type of work, the interaction with public, and the consequences of an emergency, accident, or injury. A perfect example of this that I always give is the example of a gas station attendant. And the reason I give that is a lot of times especially at night, they're working alone. And what they are in is in an environment where things could go wrong. They're dealing with people, they're dealing with money, they have very expensive products behind the counter, lottery, cigarettes, some pharmaceuticals, alcohol at this case, in Ontario now. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that's a problematic environment. It does mean that you may want to install controls. So again, for our industry, what we want to look out for is if we are being required to supply people to a work environment where the person is working alone, we want to make sure that we're understanding it. So I did see a question. Sorry, Navneet.
Yeah, so I just had this question regarding the temperature. You mentioned that there are guidelines for the cold temperature, but talking about the hot temperature, when the people are working underground in the mines, if it goes above like 50 degrees, isn't it hazardous for them?
Well, what I was saying is it's not spelled out in legislation. So if you remember from the beginning, there's the take every precaution reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
It would be covered under that area.
Okay. Okay.
So it's definitely not, and I'm not suggesting that it's not hazardous. We've all
Mm-hmm.
been in an outside environment where it's way too hot and the sun's shining on us, and we feel terrible and we get heat stroke or so forth or on that scale. So absolutely, it's a hazard. But we have to remember the Occupational Health and Safety Act is the bare minimum. So it defines the very bare minimum that we're required to operate under. Most employers will just view that as the basement level of health and safety, especially when you're talking about mining, let's say, where it does get very hot in that case. So they may have you're absolutely allowed to have expanded processes and procedures, health and safety procedures that are above what the minimum act are, right? So in that case, like the mining industry is going to have very specific processes for dealing with heat. Most, you have construction work is another one where they're outside and they're dealing with heat, and they have generally very specific rules surrounding that, like more breaks, let's say if it's above a certain threshold. Again, not covered under occupational health and safety, but it is absolutely, or the legislation rather, but absolutely is a health and safety issue. Hopefully that covered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Good. So we're going to get into workplace harassment. Workplace harassment and its co-component, especially here in Ontario, violence, is a fairly new set of rules and regulations. It's maybe 15 years old at this point. And again, it was born out of a very specific event that happened where a doctor was harassing a nurse and eventually killed the nurse. And that kind of kickstarted, we talked about harassment and violence, but it wasn't really codified under the legislation before that in Ontario. So what is workplace harassment? Workplace harassment means engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace that is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome, or workplace sexual harassment. So that is a mouthful, I guess, for what workplace harassment is. What is it actually? Workplace harassment can involve any unwelcome words, any actions that are known or should be known to be offensive, embarrassing, humiliating, or demeaning to a worker or group of workers. It can include behavior that intimidates, isolates, or even discriminates against the targeted individual. And so some practical, what can this include? Making remarks, jokes, making innuendos that demean, ridicule, intimidate, or offend. Displaying or circulating offensive pictures or materials in print or electronic form. Could be bullying. Could be repeated offensive or intimidating phone calls or emails, or workplace sexual harassment. The important thing to remember with workplace harassment is it's the receiver of the harassment that is really the marker of where it is. I could tell a joke and there could be 10 people listening to the joke. 9 people may find that funny. One person could find that joke deeply offensive. That would still be workplace harassment. It's not a numbers game. It's not like, well, 9 people thought it was funny, one person thought it was a harassing joke. That action, that behavior, it would be unacceptable in the workplace. I would say it's unacceptable in almost all places, but in the workplace, we have the responsibility as employers to maintain that workplace. What isn't workplace harassment? Luckily, the government was keen to spell this out in legislation. Workplace harassment isn't where an employer or supervisor manages or directs the worker of the workplace. So some reasonable management actions that would be part of the manager's or supervisor's normal work function, such as changing a work assignment, changing their schedule, doing a job evaluation, doing a workplace inspection, implementation of health and safety measures, and lastly, the biggest one, disciplinary action. So saying, you know what, Mr. Employee, you were 10 minutes late yesterday, you were 10 minutes late the day before, and you're 15 minutes late the day before, I'm writing you up. That is not workplace harassment, and thankfully the government has long-standingly now dictated that's not harassment. The employer is still able to do the employer's job for directing employees. Workplace sexual harassment, it started out with violence, and then it was expanded in subsequent legislation to include workplace sexual harassment. Similar sort of definition. Workplace sexual harassment is engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct against a worker in a workplace because of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, where the course of comment or conduct is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome, or making a sexual advance where the person making the advance is in a position to confer, grant, or deny a benefit. That second one talks about like a power dynamic where a supervisor says, I will give you the promotion if you go on a date with me. That would be workplace sexual harassment. Practically, what is workplace sexual harassment? That's the official definition in legislation. Unwelcome words, unwelcome actions associated with any of the protected grounds, including sex, sexual orientation, gender, that someone should know to be offensive or could possibly be offensive, embarrassing, humiliating, or demeaning. It can include a group of people or isolate individuals. And what may include practically? So it could be asking questions, talking or writing about sexual activities, rough or vulgar humor of language related to sexual orientation or gender, displaying or circulating pornography, sexual images, or offensive sexual jokes in print or email form or electronic form, leering, invading personal space, unnecessary physical contact, making gender-related comments about someone's physical characteristics, mannerisms, or conforming to sex role stereotypes, verbally abusing, threatening, or taunting someone based on gender or sexual orientation, or threatening to penalize or otherwise punish a worker if they refuse a sexual advance. All those things very rightfully are deemed to be workplace sexual harassment, and under the law and every good business are deemed completely unacceptable in the employment context. One important note where the contact or behavior includes inappropriate sexual touching, that could constitute a criminal offense. All these other could be definitely criminal offenses, but the touching, as an employer, you may want to consult with the police if you have some issue where Section 4.3 of the guide is breached. Workplace violence. Workplace violence is not what everyone expects sometimes. The official definition is the exercise of physical force by a person against a worker in a workplace that causes or could cause physical injury to the worker. An attempt to exercise physical force against a worker in a workplace that could cause physical injury to the worker. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you punched a person, let's say. It could be saying, you know what, after work, I'm going out and I'm going to punch you in the parking lot. That would be deemed workplace violence in most cases. And lastly, statement or behavior that is reasonable for a worker to interpret as a threat to exercise physical force. So that's my example of, I'm going to beat you up after work. That would be deemed workplace violence. Some of the practical aspects of it, verbally threatening to attack a worker, workplace violence, leaving threatening notes or sending threatening emails to a workplace, shaking a fist in a worker's face, wielding a weapon at work, hitting or trying to hit a worker, throwing an object at a worker, sexual violence against a worker, kicking an object the worker is standing on, such as a ladder, or trying to run down a worker using a vehicle or equipment such as a forklift. So the important thing is workplace violence, it can be outside of the actual physical act of the violence itself. And as the employer, you do want to be responsible in any sort of complaints of workplace violence. You want to make sure that you're investigating it and ensuring that people are safe as they go to work. You're going to work just to work. You're not supposed to be caused to be unsafe, especially by another worker. Going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to take a look at hazardous sound levels, so how loud things are. OELs for noise are typically given as the maximum duration of exposure permitted for various noise levels. What does this mean? So there are two factors about what an OEL is. It's called an occupational exposure limit. There is the criterion, so the steady noise permitted for a full 8-hour shift. So what's the background noise of the work environment? So if you've ever been in, let's say, an industrial setting, there's a certain noise level from just the environment itself. So the machines, the vehicles going past, the HVAC system, that's going to have a certain level of noise, certain decibels of noise. And you have a criterion where you're allowed to be exposed to. In Ontario, it's 85 decibels for an 8-hour shift. And then you have an exchange rate where the amount by which the permitted sound level may increase if the exposure time is halved. That means if the noise is louder, but you're only exposed to it for, say, 5 minutes, that changes the hazardous sound level requirements. And then again, every jurisdiction has very specific limits set out. Some may have a slightly higher or slightly lower. In Ontario, it's 85 decibels for an 8-hour shift. It's not necessary that you know like all the details about it, but one of the examples I have is if you are exposed to, the background noise of the work environment is say 90 decibels. Under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, you're not allowed to be in that work environment for a full 8 hours. You can, however, if you're wearing, for example, the earmuffs in the picture on the slide, if those cut the sound level by, say, 7 decibels, you would be permitted to work in that work environment, assuming you're wearing the earmuffs, the ear protection for the entire work shift. So what the earmuffs are doing is actually muffling the sound, reducing the sound at the person as they're experiencing the sound below the 85 decibels. This is becoming even more important now, especially as the population ages, where we didn't necessarily have these occupational health and safety rules in the past, or they weren't as stringent as they are now. And you have a lot of people who have worked their entire life starting to experience hearing loss. Hearing loss is an occupational health and safety condition covered by workers' compensation boards. We recognize the implication of work to hearing loss for people, especially when they're involved with work that was, very loud for a long time. Switching gears a little bit, we're going to take a look at first aid requirements. So employers are required to have specific elements with regards to first aid. So first aid equipment and services have to be inspected quarterly. First aid stations must be easily accessible and near a worker. You have to have a notice board displaying the first aid poster, first aid certificates, who's the trained first aid people. There must be detailed records of all incidences and first aid treatment given. And this actually expands out to the size of the workforce. So if you're looking at, these are very specific Ontario rules. There is some movement recently to harmonize the system, so every province have the exact same first aid. I would welcome that. It's a very convoluted system, especially if you're multi-provincial. So the rules in Ontario are different than New Brunswick, let's say. But here in Ontario, for every workplace with 6 or more workers, you have to have a standard first aid certificate person. The first aid stations are under the care of the worker with a valid first aid certificate. First aiders should be able to reach an injured worker within a 2-minute walk, and CPR is a mandatory module of a first aid training program. How do we look at it from a temporary employment agency perspective? If we're going into a workplace, we want to make sure that we have first aid people on site at the client, that the first aid program is a program, so they have at least one person within a 2-minute walk that's trained in first aid. I want to make sure that they have a first aid room. If the client is large enough, if they're over 100, say. It gets, very specific depending on the jurisdiction, but for our perspective, as we're doing our walkthroughs, as we're doing our client inspections, ask about the first aid program that they have. Do you have first aiders? Show me the first aid poster, take a look at those things. And again, you're just confirming that that employer is safe. If they're a very safe employer, they're going to have that information. They're going to have the first aid station. They're probably going to have a number of first aid people in case someone's on vacation. It'll be readily apparent to you. OSHA and critical injury. Critical injury is defined that is serious in nature and does one of the following: places a life in jeopardy, produces unconsciousness, results in substantial loss of blood, involves the fracture of a leg or arm but not a finger or toe, involves the amputation of a leg, arm, hand, or foot but not a finger or toe, consists of burns to a major portion of the body, or causes the loss of sight in an eye. So this is the Ontario definition of critical injury. When a critical injury occurs, the employer must notify a Ministry of Labor inspector immediately by telephone. They need to contact a member of the Joint Health and Safety Committee. There has to be a thorough investigation. And then a written report must be prepared and forwarded to the Ministry of Labor within 48 hours. So when a critical injury occurs, you're going to need to make sure that it's reported immediately. So you got to call the Ministry of Labor. You got to involve your Joint Health and Safety Committee, and you have to provide a written report to the Ministry of Labor. It's important to understand, especially where we have third party in our industry, if you're notified that one of your employees was injured and let's say had substantial loss of blood, they don't necessarily classify what a substantial loss of blood is. It's up to the employer to to classify that themselves. But if your employee had a substantial loss of blood, you want to make sure that the client has reported the incident. If the client has not reported the incident, you want to make sure that you're reporting it. You want to have that communication with the client to figure out who's reporting it because there was a substantial loss of blood. Again, in our situation, we need to make sure that we're very clear and upfront in these things as we're dealing with them with our clients. So OSA and critical injury. So we have another scenario. A new client places an order for a general labor. It is the final assembly line that wraps in boxes, cans of cat food. They will then lift the newly packaged box and put it on the skid. Another worker will use a forklift to pick up the skid when it is full. The customer tells you that they run a very safe operation and they've won multiple health and safety awards. Training is provided around their safety procedures. Safety boots are required and gloves will be provided to the employees. After the second week, the employee placed at the assignment tells you that they will not return. The reason being, when you've investigated the issue, is the equipment that is used to put plastic wrap on the case of food is blocked, and they want you to push the product through with your hand using more force. They've also asked, in the absence of the forklift driver, you operate the forklift and move the skids to a designated area. You refused, but the supervisor said everyone does it. Lastly, you burned yourself while packaging, and your supervisor told you you had to be more careful. You do not feel safe, and the supervisor intimidates you. So using that scenario, can you or the customer discipline your employee for refusing to work? True or false? Please record your answer. So the best answer is actually false. You and the customer are prohibited from penalizing, dismissing, disciplining, suspending, or threatening to do any of these things for a worker who has refused to work. If you remember back to about the beginning of the presentation, one of the basic rights of a worker is the ability to refuse unsafe work. And we'll get into some of the nuances of that in a moment. So employees allowed to refuse unsafe work. They can refuse anytime. So anytime the physical condition of the workplace or workstation is likely to endanger your employee. Any machine, equipment, or tool that the worker is using or the physical condition of the workplace is likely to endanger your employee or another worker. So it's talking about not just the worker themselves, but if, let's say, a piece of equipment is, as per the employee, dangerous enough that someone else is going to get injured, they can refuse that work. And lastly, workplace violence is present is likely to endanger your employee. So back to our scenario, will the employee will not be paid while refusing to work? True or false? The employee will not be paid while refusing to work. So the answer in this case is false. Again, this is a basic right of the employee. They need to be paid for the period where this is sorted out. So they will be paid during the first stage of a work refusal. During the second stage, the employee may be asked to perform other work, either at the customer site or another customer site. You do want to handle these work refusals as they come up. They are required by, again, it's spelled out in OSA. You want to make sure you have a process in place. So what's a refusal of work at stage one? Stage one, some key aspects to it is you need to make sure the worker stops immediately. So if the worker says, I'm working at this machine and the guarding is loose and I think I'm gonna hurt myself, you need to make sure that that worker stops working at the machine. Supervisor, they have to investigate it. You are going to want to involve the Joint Health and Safety Committee. Again, these are your clients. The workers should remain close to the site while the investigation is being conducted. So you don't want to send the worker home while you're taking a look at this investigation. You send them to a safe place, whether it's a lunchroom or an employee area. And then you have to report the incident to the actual workplace. Many times, hopefully, you're able to resolve the situation at stage one. And the supervisor will come in, Joint Health and Safety Committee will come in and say, Mr. Employee, I agree with you, the guarding isn't properly fixed, we'll get maintenance on it and they fix it and the employee just returns back to their regular work. If that doesn't happen, we proceed to stage 2. Stage 2 is either the supervisor says, no, that machine is safe, or corrective action is taken and the employee will not return to the machine because they deem it still to be unsafe. The employee is allowed to continue to refuse. So you want to report this. Problem is, once this happens and the employee continues to refuse work, now you hit stage 3. Stage 3 is where you have to contact the Ministry of Labor. You don't want to be in stage 3 because at that point, you're going to invite the government into the workplace or the client workplace to come take a look at the problem. They're going to be the mediator to the situation. So they're going to go look at the machine, they're going to look at the process, the procedures, and they're going to give an opinion, a final opinion in most cases, on whether that's safe or not. The problem is if they're looking at that process, they may start to look at other processes. What I'm saying here is there is an advantage to dealing with a work refusal immediately. And some of the ways you can deal with a work refusal is if the worker continues to refuse to work at that machine, you can't place them at another machine. So if maybe machine A, they view it as unsafe, but machine B, they view it as safe, you could put them there. Sometimes in some cases, you can put another employee to that machine. So whereas I might view the machine as unsafe, another employee might look at that machine and be perfectly okay with it. An example of if there's very heavy lifting and the person is very small in nature or stature, they may not be able to lift that heavy bag of whatever the product is. Another employee may be a larger stature, maybe be stronger, maybe they work out more, and deem that as they don't have a refusal in place. They don't deem it as unsafe. The important thing is you want to make sure that you are dealing with this problem and you have a process in place. If you have a work refusal and an employee makes a complaint to the Ministry of Labor, the Ministry of Labor is going to come to you and say, Mr. Employer, what did you do? Mrs. Employer, what did you do? You need to make sure you're dealing with these things appropriately. And so the reason we draw your attention to this is, again, because it is specified in occupational health and safety legislation. We're going to switch gears to our last topic. We're going to look at provincial compensation acts. So we discussed previously, there's a number of parties involved with worker health and safety in the workplace. You have managers, employees, employers, supervisors, workers, and the government. We're all responsible, have some level of responsibility for health and safety. And we're going to see how this has come about in terms of the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act or the Workers' Compensation Act, depending on your province. What is the purpose of the act? So workplace safety and insurance is something different than what the Occupational Health and Safety Act is. Workers' compensation is an insurance plan, it's a program that works to compensate employees who are injured or disabled from workplace accidents, rather. They want to ensure the successful return to work of employees following work-related injuries. They want to promote health and safety in the workplace and reduce injuries and disease. And they want to facilitate the return of work and recovery of workers. One of the things we need to understand about workers' compensation, it's called a no-fault system. So compensation for the worker it doesn't matter who is at fault. You don't have to prove negligence. You don't have to prove anything else. As long as the employee was injured under good faith. So if they're horsing around, they may not be covered, but if they are in good faith acting in the workplace and they are injured in the workplace, they will be covered. Workers' compensation is funded 100% by employers. Common misconception is that workers' compensation is covered by the general population. How workers' compensation works is employers are, in most cases, required by law to have coverage by the workers' compensation, and then they report the insurable earnings for all the employees, and then they pay a premium on top of that. So it depends on all sorts of things, but essentially you're going to pay a certain percentage of your insurable earnings to the workers' compensation board, and that funds the compensation board. So it funds the worker income replacement, it funds the healthcare, it funds retraining if necessary, and that's part of the system. The thing we have to remember as employers is there are strong financial and legal implications to workers' compensation. Financial, again, you're covering, so you report your insurable earnings, and then you're covering, or you're providing to the workers' compensation a specific amount, um, which can be substantial depending on the kind of work you are. Alternatively, the Workers' Compensation Act allows the Workers' Compensation Board to implement the very specific legal rulings to the employer. So if you're not following the Workers' Compensation Act, Workers' Compensation Board can say, Mr. Employer, you're required by law to do X, Y, and Z. So let's say if a worker is injured, you're required to re-employ that employee. Doesn't really matter if you want to, doesn't matter if you don't want to. That is the declaration of the Workers' Compensation Board as provided by the Workers' Compensation Act. Gives them the ability to do so. Very important to understand your rights and responsibilities as employers under the Act. So what happens when there's injury or loss of work? The Act ensures that employees receive support by returning them to work at the pre-injury position or other suitable work. So it doesn't necessarily mean, in our case, this is an important distinction. If you're supplying the employee to company A, let's say, and they get injured there, but they're able to work at company B, maybe the physicality is just less at company B, you're absolutely, as a temporary employment agency, allowed to place them at the company B, as long as it's within their physical abilities and restrictions. The other action of the Act is to assist finding alternative employment if the injury prevents him or her from continuing with the current employer. So what that means, essentially, after a set number of time where an employee is injured and they're unable, or they're just not progressing, they're not getting better, and they're not able to return to that work. So let's say it's a very physical job. What will happen is the Workers' Compensation Board will retrain that person. So they will put them in a new line of work, which will include things like retraining them. So if whatever training they may need to do they'll go through an assessment, but they will retrain the worker. Maybe computer skills, it may be language skills, it might be getting their grade 12 diploma. The employee will be retrained and the employer will pay for that. And lastly, they will ensure that compensation is paid to the worker until they're made whole. Or if a worker is fatally injured, survivors, depending on the nature of the relationship. What's one of the most important things when a workplace injury happens is record keeping. As soon as you're made aware of it, you want to start recording that information. You want to record all conversations with an injured worker. You want to do things in writing. You want to make sure you have a program in place in your company. Some of the things, like initially when an accident happens, you want to know the date and time of occurrence, name witnesses, nature of injury, location of injury, details of any first aid treatment given. You want to basically do an investigation into what happened. It's very important to do that as soon as possible. There are very specific requirements under workers' compensation for reporting injuries and illnesses and so forth. As the employer, you want to make sure that you have that information available. It's documented and it's becomes a historic document for you. There's an old saying: if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Just because you had a conversation with an employee, unless you have notes on it, unless you have an email, let's say, where, I confirm that I spoke to the injured employee and you provide the details of that conversation, unless it's in writing, it really didn't happen. You want to be prepared, even if it doesn't seem serious, you want to get that information. So if an employee says, you know what, I sprained my ankle or I hurt my ankle at work, you want to still treat that as an investigation in a lot of cases, because it may become a workers' compensation issue in the future. So I might hurt myself on Wednesday, but it's not until Friday where I'm like, I can't continue working. It's a little more serious than I thought, and I'm going to start missing work, or I got to go to the doctor. At that point, what's originally known as just a first aid injury becomes a workers' compensation compensable injury. We want to make sure that we have all the details when these events happen. So going back, when there is a critical injury in the workplace, the manager is required to report the injury within 24 to 36 hours of the injury taking place to the safety group, 3 days to workers' compensation, immediately to the Ministry of Labor, 2 days with a written report to the Ministry of Labor, all the above, or F, which is B, C, D only. Please record your answer in the chat function and we'll discuss. Okay, so the best answer in this case is F. When a critical injury occurs, we do have to report it within 3 days to workers' compensation. If you remember back to the critical injury page earlier, we have to immediately report it by telephone to the Ministry of Labor. And then lastly, within 2 days, we have to provide a written report to the Ministry of Labor. And again, you want to make sure that this is very clearly spelled out when this happens between the client and the agency. You want to make sure you're recording who's doing what and ensuring that it is reported appropriately. In most cases, workers' compensation, in almost all cases, workers' compensation will be the agency's responsibility, as they are the employer of record. When you're talking about the critical injury itself and the report to the Ministry of Labor, again, be very clear with your client who's doing what. So if there is an accident and the employee is going to be absent from work or requires health care as a result of the workplace accident, you must report this to the WCB within 3 calendar days. Your worker loses time from work, your worker earns less than regular state pay, or your worker gets outside healthcare treatment. The way I explain it within our own company is 2 things you got to remember. If the worker is going to miss work past the day of injury, or the worker receives any medical treatment, you're going to need to do a WCB report, WSIB report in Form 7 here in Ontario. You can wait here in Ontario 7 days if your worker just does modified work at full pay, or they need nothing beyond first aid. So essentially, you don't need to report it unless those 7 days are breached, or one of the other 2 things occurs: they lose time, or they go to a medical professional. So return to work and duty to modify work, that is a requirement. So employers are required under the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act to provide modified duties while the employee recovers. So it means if they were, let's say, doing heavy lifting, maybe you could reduce the lifting and put them on like a quality control event. You may have to switch them to a different area of the workplace. In some cases with the temporary employment agency, you may not have work at that particular client, and you may either have to put them at another client, or you may provide modified work in the office, inside your office, or something of that nature. Sometimes you do have to be creative in our world, but it is absolutely a requirement by the Act. And there's certain things you have to take a look at when you're looking at this. So you have to make sure that the work is achievable. When work is achievable, we have to make sure that we're providing confidence, as well as ensuring the work is able to be done based on the worker's injury and limitations. So the worker has to be able to actually accomplish the task, especially while they are injured. They may be impaired. They may not be able to, say, walk as fast, or maybe not able to go as fast as they were doing. So you have to take a look and make sure that the worker is able to do the work. You have to make sure it's safe. You have to make sure that they're not going to injure themselves further. You have to take a look at some of the medical documentation that you may have, whether it's a Form 8 or a physiotherapy report. You have to ensure that they are not going to create a bigger problem by working. You have to make sure it's constructive. You have to make sure that they are doing something. They're contributing to the skill development of the person. And lastly, you have to make sure that it's productive. You have to make sure that the work is actually achieving something. You can't just have them sit inside the cafeteria, say, and watch Netflix for 8 hours a day. That's neither constructive nor productive. They're not actually achieving anything. You're essentially punishing the worker for being injured. And that's not something you want to be doing. Taking a look at another case study. I think we'll skip this one. This one's not very applicable today. We'll skip Alberta. So taking a look at core recommendation, we will skip this section as well. So one of the requirements today was to ensure that you're able to find information. Health and safety workers' compensation is a massive field. Laws are changing all the time. Workers' compensation changes their policy. Things get updated. New ailments, new injuries get added. It's impossible for the person, even if you're doing it every single day, it's almost impossible to keep up with all the information. What we have here is a number of links for learners. These are the compensation boards for all the provinces, and it highlights where you can go to, depending on where your province is, where you're located. You can go to your provincial workers' compensation board and get some good information. This slide here is some more generalized safety information. So the first one, the Canadian Centre for Occupational Safety and Health, they're great. This is a great organization, provides a lot of information with regards to performing work safely. And they have all sorts of jobs. They have safety protocols for shoveling. It's a great repository of information, a great library of information for you, especially if you're trying to, build some processes or job descriptions within your work. I keep that one tagged. It's really good. You have some other government organizations. Another one is CANLI. If you're taking a look at some of the rules and regulations about workers' compensation, that's another good one. It tells you all the jurisdictions, all the legislations, some of the regulations as well. So that concludes our presentation today. If you do have any questions that were not answered, by all means, direct them to ACSESS. ACSESS, it's our association. Your company provides funding to ACSESS. They are the voice of our industry. If you have health and safety questions, by all means, present them to it. I do want to say good luck to everyone as you write your CPC test. I'm sure you'll be fine. We've covered all the information you're going to need to be successful today under the health and safety module. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Take care.
Thank you, Dave.